Let me start my timer. Can you hear me okay? I can project if I need to project. Thank you very much, Christoph, and thank you all for being such a collegiate group of people. It's been a wonderful, singular experience to be here for the 2.5 months I've been here, and I think it's probably the first time in my life that I've been relieved of the obligations I have to other people. And so it's been a great relief, and it's been stupendously productive for me. One of the great things about being a historian is that it really is a bully pulpit, because everything has a history, and as a result you can write about anything that suits your fancy. And so I've chosen to write about birds for the last 6 or 7 years because I'm interested in them. And people ask me, how did you get interested in birds? Did you like birds growing up in Hawaii? Well, not particularly, although I like the natural world. I was headed up to the Arctic Ocean with my martial arts instructor in 1992 to go for a swim in the Arctic Ocean. And we stopped at a little gas station north of the Arctic Circle, and he said, you know, you should get a field guide to birds because there are a lot of them up here. And I did, and rarely do you have a moment when the heavens open up and something crashes down on you, but I opened up the book and looked at it for a few minutes. And then I think I uttered a string of epithets, which is what I do when I'm excited, I swear. And I thought, this is the greatest thing ever. I can take something in the natural world, which is a messy tangle of things, and I can make sense of it. I can bring order to it. And then, as I became a historian, I thought I can also write about them and find useful things to say about them. One of the most wonderful things about birds is that they live at the resonant intersection of biology, culture, politics, law, anthropology, and many other things. And so they're a really wonderful way to talk about and make sense of both current events and current arguments and research problems in history and the history of science, but also to try to inform modern biology, because I think historians have an obligation to be practical in their work. And I think it's important to have a forward-looking goal when you're a historian. I think you want to inform not the past, but the future, the present and the future. And so this book I've been working on makes me nervous a little bit, because I'm not a biologist. But I've got a lot of science in here, and it's the only time I've worked on a project where I've gotten to interview a lot of scientists who are alive and well, mostly. And so I want to get the scientific details right, and it's challenging because there are a lot of them. And as is the case with everyone's project, you really could make a separate book out of each of your chapters, right? I think some of you had that sensation where you really need to find a way to refine your story. So let me go into my story. I'm using my remote control and not the twitchy one that the RCC has. So if any of you want to borrow this while you're here, let me know. Okay, so I'm trying to tell the story in 5 chapters, and there's a bird per chapter. So the bird at the upper left is a bird known in Hawaii only from the fossil record, Taiokin pau, or the stumbling moanalo, or the clumsy moanalo as it's also known. Pau is a Hawaiian word for finished. How many of you have been to Hawaii? Small percentage of you. Okay. So the first bird is a bird known only from the fossil record, and I'm going to give you a little takeaway in a minute about each of these chapters, and then I'm going to go into a little more detail. And then, and in the hope that it isn't like speed dating or speed chess, I'm going to try to get down at about 27 minutes. So the second bird is a bird that has gone extinct but was known in the Polynesian era and into the contact era, a bird called the Kauai o'o, Mahoba, also known as the dwarf o'o. And if you really want to say the whole Hawaiian name properly, it's the o'oa'a, with lots of little glottal stops and, I don't know what they're called, those diacritical straight lines over the O's. The third bird there is the Palila, Loxioides balui. My daughter has the middle name of this bird, Palila. My son is Jay, so he got a bird name too, but I couldn't really call her Loxioides, so Palila it is. That's an critically endangered honey creeper that is found only on the Big Island of Hawaii. The fourth bird is the Japanese white-eye, Zostrops japonicus, which was introduced into the islands in around 1929 or so by a group called the Huimanu, which was a comfort society or an acclimatization society. Very interested in these people because of the confounding ways in which they've been studied quite a bit, but the Huimanu has not been studied at all. They poured thousands of individual birds over dozens of species into the islands in hopes of both fighting insects and in adorning the islands with beautiful plumage. All the lowland birds had been wiped out way before the 20th century, and so it was their attempt to repopulate the islands with things they recognized from the comforts of home. And then the fifth bird there is the chapter I've developed the least. It's a bird called the apapane. It doesn't have an English common name. It's Sanguinea himatione is the name of the bird, and it's a thriving endemic species. It's a generalist. It lives in lots of different territories and has lots of different food sources and so on. Okay, so I'm trying to make each of these chapters make sense on its own as a little bucket. And so the takeaway for this first chapter is extinction was much worse 1,500 years ago, or 1,000 years ago, at least in Hawaii, than it is today. There's something called the background rate of extinction. And it's very, very complicated to try to figure out and challenging to figure out what's gone extinct naturally, because everything, 99% of the species on the planet have gone extinct since the start of biological life on the planet. As Al Gore has famously said, the background rate of extinction is now 1,000 times faster than it was before humans. So extinction's obviously been an accelerated pace. You're certainly familiar with people like Elizabeth Colbert's book, The Sixth Extinction, which certainly plays into common topics here. They were good eating in Hawaii. They were slow. They were what biologists call naive, because you could walk up to them and shake their little paw with no penalty and then club them on the head and take them home and eat them. And they were apparently delicious. And so this is a particular bird called the Tyokin pau is a bird in this 4 species group. And it was tasty and it went extinct very quickly. We'll come back to that. So the takeaway for the second chapter is that biologists simply watched and commented and preserved in a different sense for today. One of the enduring questions I've had for the last 3 or 4 years is, why in the world did naturalists who were looking at extinct birds at the end of the 19th century say, oh my God, it's almost extinct, thank God you got another species. Thank God you got another example. Thank God you've killed it, but it's going to go extinct pretty soon. And I finally figured out why that's happened. So I'll elaborate on that in a little bit. The third bird is the palila, and the complexities of keeping an endangered bird alive are complex. And so the palila's story has been one not just of biology but of law, cultural struggles among native peoples and hunters in Hawaii, and attempts to preserve habitat for birds that have very specialized diets and locations in which to live. And you know, I said in my last book, I don't think historical research is worth a damn unless it's based on the archival record, and that's a clear channeling of my prejudices about historical research. And it's certainly the case in this book that I quote constantly from the archival record. I've uncovered a ton of things about a lot of these people that have not come to light before. And one of my jobs, as I see it as a historian, is to try to unearth and present many of the quotidian details that make up the lives, at least recently in my work, of naturalists whose daily lives aren't really well documented in a particular sense in the published sources. So, fourth bird, this is a pair of the huimanu, a pair of the Japanese wide-eye, little courtship dance there. And you can see on the left kind of a pro. We need some birds from the outside to populate the islands. And to a later comment talking about how this miserable creature, the white, is eating all of our fruit. And in some ways, the introduced species story is the takeaway for this book, because you'll see in a bit, one of my arguments is that everything comes from somewhere else, right? Everything that came to Hawaii came from somewhere else, everything. There aren't even extremophiles that can live in the hot lava temperatures. I mean, Hawaii was essentially a sterile environment when it was created. And it wasn't until rafts of spiders and bats and birds and other insects worked their way to the island, and spores in their poop and other things started to populate the land. So everything in Hawaii is from somewhere else. And you can say that more unambiguously about Hawaii, I think, than most other places, because things get lost in the mists of time, and creation stories aren't quite so neat in a sense as they are in Hawaii. So I think that colors the aspects of belonging. And this issue of belonging is a key one here. What belongs, what doesn't belong. And then the fifth bird, as I said, it's a generalist. This was one of the birds who are harvested for feathers, and I've had to tone down the feather story quite a bit, but Hawaiian bird feathers probably contribute to some key aspects of extinction in specific examples. Okay, so the key things I'm trying to make sense of. This issue of belonging. Who gets to decide what belongs? What does belonging mean? And how to make sense of this both biologically and culturally. And so I think the confounding nature of belonging really stands people's sometimes strident discussions of introduced species. There's become a very militarized language talking about invasive species, so they're invasive, okay? They're attackers, they're invaders. Well, they don't have any culpability in the sense that they weren't sentiently invading anything. They're just there. And so there's been some marvelous work done on this. Matthew Chu has written a couple of wonderful pieces about this sort of demilitarizing invasion biology. And I find this very interesting in both its specifics and in its implications. Okay, big, tasty, flightless bird. This isn't my specific bird, but I don't have a good illustration of it otherwise. This is one of its cousins or congeners, as they say in biology. It was a duck that evolved into a giant flightless duck. Looked like a goose, big like a goose, but DNA-wise, it's like a duck. This is, so one of the things I've tried to do is pair particular naturalists with these particular birds. In a perfect world, I would have had naturalist bird geography, but I can't quite make a neat triangle out of each of them. And so I've done it in some cases. So the first one is represented by Storrs Olson, who's one of the world's foremost avian paleontologists. He's at the Smithsonian. This is him at age 8, and I find it interesting. He's studying dinosaurs and wearing a Hawaiian shirt way before he was he was a legend. He's retired, and he's helped me shape this book somewhat. So Larry Small was the Smithsonian secretary who got into a lot of trouble because he had illegally kept bird feathers that were on endangered species lists in his house and his collections, and so he was actually indicted for this. And Storrs also made up about 3,000 or 4,000 stickers that said "Dump Small," and he put them all over the Smithsonian, and people, directors' cars, and they were furious at him, but he was too prominent to be fired for it, really. So he's really a colorful fellow. This is a poor picture I took of one of the lower mandible of this Tiocan pau with its tooth-like structures and its jaw, and you can see how small the head is relative to the body in the illustration you saw. As a tiny head and a tiny jaw, and then its various disarticulated parts. Okay, so now without transition here, I go on to the second bird, Mahoba, and the yellow feathers, the tail feathers that were so popular. I hope some of you aren't offended at these. I've got a fair number of specimens of dead birds, or several of them. I wrote a blog posting for the Huntington called "Slow Down and Smell the Birds," which there is a smell issue related to Hawaiian birds I find very interesting. I'll tell you about in a minute, but I got a lot of comments about how horrified people were to see these pictures of dead birds. Well, these are the mortal remains of these species, and they're the things that scientists can study to make sense of speciation, and all sorts of things can be studied through these study collections. Here's some more of the Mahoba, the Carlile. Went extinct in around 1987 or 88. Was recorded in 1987, last seen in 1985. And the papers I have, the biologist that goes along with this bird is a guy named John Sincock, who was this legendary cowboy biologist. I've got so many stories about him, I'm having a hard time winnowing them down. He had incredible stamina. He once hiked nearly 40 miles across the length and width of Kauai because he was tired of waiting for the helicopter to come pick him up in the forest where he had been for 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 days. And he wrote these terse weekly reports back to his bosses at Patuxent Wildlife Center in Virginia, I think, every week for 8 or 9 years. So they're wonderful reading. He once was so frustrated with the undergrowth, because the story of collecting birds in Hawaii is one of great frustration because the terrain is so impassable and the vegetation is so thick. He simply set down his pack, jumped into a river, swam to Lihui, Kauai, and then a few days later got a helicopter ride back up to pick up his pack. But he was the guy that rediscovered this bird after having gone extinct. So in 1967, he and his wife spotted it. And here's some more. This is Molly Hagerman, the collections manager at the Bishop Museum, with a run of these study skins. I learned how to make these when I worked for the LA. When I was early in my career, I had Mondays off, and so I would go into work Tuesday through Saturday, and I contacted the Natural History Museum. My last book has a whole chapter on these study collections, and so I want to learn how to make them. So you essentially take a dead bird, you cut it up, you do some things to disarticulate the skeleton, you remove the innards and the brain, you stuff it with cotton batting, and that's how they're preserved. And you do some other things as well. And over the course of about a year, I learned how to do this. So they let me come in and make my own specimen, which I'll tell you about in a second. So this is a little squib from my book about the specimens. There are 101 of these birds that still survive. I wax a little purple here in my prose. But I think it's both touching and essential to understand what's left of these creatures, what their parts consist of. And I actually had to get these weighed and then aggregated so I could figure out how much biomass was left on the planet from this extinct bird. Okay. Generally, the biggest extinction threats for all endemic species of birds everywhere are these three things. Destruction of their habitat, which includes usually their food sources. All sorts of introduced predators, from dogs to cats to mongoose. There's no such word as mongoose, it's mongooses. And then avian diseases that appeared in the 19th century in different places, but especially in Hawaii, avian pox, toxoplasmosis, avian malaria. These are just some shots of the palila. Okay, and then so the palila this is a quick, semi-interesting story I will burden you with for a second. They misnamed this bird when they gave it its scientific name because they transposed the name, the I and the E in Theodore Ballieu, the discoverer's name. I don't have a photo of him. I've never been able to find one. He was a French consul to Honolulu in the 1860s and 1870s. He shot one of these birds on the Big Island and collected it, and the type specimen is at the National Museum of Natural History in Paris. I tried to get this name changed, and it's not easy to get a scientific name changed. You have to write an article for a journal called Zootaxa, which is an international arbiter for scientific names. I got lots of advice. I followed a very specific formula, and ultimately they denied my request to change this name after 130 years because nowhere in the original article does it have his name spelled. Is he referred to by name? So on a technicality, they denied my common sense attempt to right a scientific wrong. But I work a little spiel about that into the book. So everything is grist for my mill. So one of the things I got to do when I was last in Honolulu in September was to make a study skin out of this bird. And I had other slides in here I've taken out because they're pretty gruesome. But this is the setup. You take tissue samples, you take feather samples, and we made a complete skeleton of the bird ultimately. And it was very touching. They let me keep one of the feathers. I'm going to give it to my daughter at some point because there aren't very many palila feathers around. The introduced species. So this is a similar quote from the earlier slide, but here are the people saying, nothing bad will happen if we introduce these birds. Let's do it. So I have a lot of information about people trying to persuade the commissioners of the Board of Agriculture in Hawaii to let these birds into the country. Oh, they're fine. They're going to be fine. We're pretty sure they'll be fine, and here are the reasons we think they're fine. We're not sure, but they'll probably do more good than harm. And this is a fundamental notion in this work, more good than harm. Scientists and biologists don't think like that so much anymore. It's a much more of a zero tolerance for introducing species. And so there's a lot in here about this notion of just what it takes to have some level of confidence about these species showing up on distant shores. One of the things that's true about Hawaii is that people go there. For the few of you that have been there, you know that it's fragrant, it's beautiful, the air has a softness to it. That is all natural to the climate. But if you look at this quote from someone who was there in the 1880s and then wrote a book about it in the 1890s, you'll see that she goes on, Helen Mather goes on about the fruit there. Okay, so but all but one of these delicious fruits came to the islands on ships of explorers and conquerors. So grapes, probably by Captain Vancouver in the 1790s. Mangoes came from Manila in 1824 from South America. Pineapples came from South America in the early 19th century. Only the banana was brought by pre-contact Hawaiians, and it wasn't there before they were there. So really, if you were to somehow wave a magic wand and strip out of the environment all of the things that weren't in Hawaii, say, 200 years ago, you'd be bereft. You wouldn't find any of these things, almost any of these things at hand, as with the birds. So the lowlands were silent. The birds had been stripped out of the landscape by a rat that the Polynesians brought along, Rattus excellens, the Polynesian rat, which promptly destroyed all of the habitat for birds in the lowlands of Hawaii. So not only were none of these fruits there, none of the plants and birds were there either that were endemic to Hawaii. Okay, acclimatization societies or comfort societies. A lot of people have tried to introduce species from elsewhere in the course of the last 150 years or so. There's a good book to be written about these acclimatization societies because they had an enormous impact. Somewhat all akin to Alfred Crosby's book, Grain Imperialism, but on a more modern scale, I guess, would be the way to think about treating these acclimatization societies. So there were a lot of these groups. This is the number of introduced species by island in the last 100 and 200 years, mostly on the Big Island in Oahu. And then by the quarter century, and these are all bird introductions. Here are the Huimanu years. This comfort society founded in 1930 attempted 76 species, and some 20 of them succeeded. And then the Apapane, this honey creeper, used along with this bird for Hawaiian cloaks. People thought they were wonderful, and there's a long story about whether the birds, and big questions about whether the birds actually survived. Some people say they caught the birds and plucked their feathers and turned them loose. Other people say, well, they would have killed the birds. Other people say, well, they probably ate them after they caught them. So the role of feather collecting in Hawaii and its impact on bird populations is unknown to a large degree. But you can reach all sorts of tentative conclusions I won't go into. Okay, one last factor, that's a smell factor here. So for about 140 years, people have commented on the fact that there's a class of honey creeper in Hawaii that has this musky smell, often likened to wet canvas. And I want to figure out what that smell is. So I'm trying to find an organic chemist because the Apapane is one of these birds, and it's common enough I could get a specimen, and I could find a chemist to sample the VOCs, the volatile organic compounds, and see what the smell is. And once I know what the smell is, I can make some speculations about what the function of the smell was. Was it an attractant for a mate? Was it a defensive mechanism? What was it? So I've got a smell thing going with the birds as well. Okay, and finally, these are the bits, and they're not trivial bits, as you'll see about that I want to fit into my puzzle that relate to this project. Even Kirksey's presentation here was really helpful to me because he helped neatly sidestep some of the issues about the black and whiteness in some people's mind of introduced species. Who to love and what to love, how to love, and what to love at the bottom there. I think one of our anxieties about extinction becomes very personal. It foregrounds our own mortality as individuals and as a species. And I think you can't help but think that way, whether you want to or not, as a human. And so I think that is a confounding factor for a lot of this. I'm working my way backwards here from the top to the bottom. Some of these species that are introduced actually prove to be good they are both bad and good. So the Japanese wide-eye has proven to be a pollinator that has imperfectly replaced extinct species that can pollinate plants whose original pollinators are gone. So they're serving a function of their own. Also, many of these species have evolved in the time they've been in the islands in the last 200-300 years. Does that make them, does that give them a right to be more local? Maybe. Okay, and then Tom Van Doren's work, and he's written on the alala, the Hawaiian crow, Corvus hawaiiensis. And he's written a wonderful piece and some wonderful things about mourning as a form of resurrection, because it's easy to get into this declensionist narrative about extinction, right? We're going to hell in a handbasket. There's not much we can do about it. There's got to be another turn. And so people have had some very interesting anthropological and cultural turns to try to understand different thinkings about extinction that are somewhat resurrectionist, I guess. And then the role of Native peoples in Hawaii. Perhaps unlike the Aboriginal case in Australia, there are so many, maybe it's not different at all, I don't know much about it, but there's such a spectrum of people with Hawaiian blood that it's not easy to say you're a native, you're not a native, simply on the basis of blood. And so, but obviously they were there when the birds were there, and they play a role in the story throughout, but I haven't reached anything that's conclusive about their role, and I probably won't. Okay, and that is at 26 minutes, and thank you very much.